Okay, so the book of Jeremiah, well, it's all about an Israelite priest who was working in Jerusalem. He was called by God to warn Israel of the consequence of breaking their covenant with God. It's a story that happens so many times through the Old Testament. So the Israelites, they were worshipping idols and they were not living it right. There was lots of injustices going on in the time that they were living. And he even warned that Babylon, their enemies, would come as God's servant to bring judgment and take the people into exile. And in the end, he witnessed Babylon coming and destroying Jerusalem personally. Okay, so how did this all work? Who wrote the book and those things? Well, in chapter 36, after 20 years of Jeremiah preaching, it says that God called him to actually write down all of the stories, and he called Baruch, and Baruch came and wrote them down. And he not only gathered Jeremiah's works and his poems and his prophecies, but other stories about his life, and created this big sort of anthology that is Jeremiah. And it's a well laid out book for that. And he wanted to present Jeremiah as the prophet messenger of God and of God's grace. So we're talking about the time here where Jeremiah started his ministry, and that's in the time that's sort of 626, 627 BC, and continued his ministry until just after the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Okay, so here's a bit of an overview. So Jeremiah is called to be a prophet to the nations by God in a very clear way at the beginning of the book. And he's told that he's going to be a prophet to Israel, and he's going to be a prophet to the nations. And his words are going to do things of both. They're going to pull down a whole load of stuff that isn't right, or at least predict it. And then he's also going to layer in hope about what God is going to do for the future. And his book's just great. It's got some great passages of hope in it, and it's got some real messages of destruction and where things need to get brought back into line with what God's original plan was. So in chapters 1 to 24, there's a collection of writings, and this is all before the exile is taken about, and it's all really about Israel having not got it right. They've got it wrong in how they're living their lives. They've broken their promises with God. They're not following the commands of the Torah. They keep worshipping other gods. And Jeremiah, he just can't stand that. And that's his job, to come and warn the people of this. And he has a real clever sort of wordplay in how he presents this to those guys. And he starts to do it as their idolatry is like adultery. It's as though they're cheating on God by worshipping idols. And then he uses this metaphor with the idea of things like promiscuity and unfaithfulness. And it's just not showing that the people are in a proper relationship with God as God intends for them to be. And Jeremiah then accuses the leaders, he accuses the priests, he accuses prophets, and he says they're unjust in not doing the right thing, in not protecting God's people, in not protecting the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, which is what God had asked them to do. They're just not caring for people in the way that God needed them to, wanted them to, and was set out in the Torah for them to do. And it didn't seem to matter what Jeremiah did. These guys did not want to change. They did not seem to care, and they just wanted to say, go away. And you've got a pretty good example of what was going on in the middle of this in Jeremiah chapter 7. This is often called Jeremiah's temple sermon. And you've got Jeremiah talking about, you've got the priests inside, they're worshipping God properly, they're following the commands, but outside the temple, people are worshipping other gods, and they're even doing child sacrifices. And you've got this with just a wall in between them. And so he's got this idea that God is going to come and judge, and he's going to come and wipe them out. And he's prophesied that Babylon is going to come to them, and he's going to bring God's judgment, and they're going to be in exile for 70 years. And basically, this is not going to escape anyone. And he talks about this idea that this cup is there, and everybody is going to have to drink from it. Then you've got this section from 26 to 45, which is all about the siege of Babylon on Israel, but actually it's filled with hope for Israel that God has. And it starts off with Jeremiah warning the leaders, but that's rejected. In the midst of this section, there is all of this hope that gets poured in from Jeremiah about the prophecies that are all about Israel's future and this aspect that God is going to restore his people and he wouldn't forget about them. And actually, this is part of the process to weed that stuff out because God has a great plan for the future. You'll recognize that tone from the most famous verse from Jeremiah 2. Then there's lots of the ideas that God really wants to be in that union, that communication, that relationship with his people. And he's going to bring about that restoration through the Messiah, back into the promised land, back into the way that God had promised. And all of this is for the end goal, that is that all nations are going to come and worship the true God, the God of Israel, through the Messiah and back into this glorious place where we can all have this perfect communication, this perfect relationship with God. So the stories about Jerusalem being under siege and being destroyed. And then eventually Jeremiah himself is kidnapped by some Israelite rebels and he's taken to Egypt against his will. And then in chapters 46 to 61, you've got the judgment and the hope for the nations, not just Israel here. And you've got lots of poems about how God is going to use Babylon to judge the other nations that are around Israel and how eventually God is going to judge Babylon too. He's used them to get his purposes, but actually they're not following God's commands either. So God is going to judge them and bring about their downfall too. And then the book ends with the exile, but it's a bit like it's a teaser for a modern movie. You get to the trailers and then you've still got this little bit of hope that's in there. And the hope is the former king of Israel. He's in captivity, but actually he's of David's line. That's the hope. And he's being kept alive, and he actually gets to go and eat at the king's table. And this sets us up, really, it says the story is coming. There's hope still alive. There's still a thread of hope that's left in here. Okay, so a key verse. Well, Jeremiah is filled with some incredible verses of hope. It'd be really easy for me to pick Jeremiah 29 verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And that is a great verse. It's one of the most famous verses from the Bible. I also love the verse from Jeremiah 29 verse 13. It just follows on a few verses later and it says that you will seek me and find me when you seek me with your whole heart. But actually, I want to use this verse as a key verse for you today. And it's from Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. And this is about us as well. This is exactly the same attitude that God has towards us. And it says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And this is exactly the same that God is with you and with me. Before you were formed, before you were born, before anything was even created, God had a plan for us. He set us apart to be different than the world. That's why we've got to live to a different set of rules. That's why we've got to follow God. That's why God has an awesome plan for us as long as we're doing those things that help set us apart for God. And then he gave us a very specific job to do. For Jeremiah, he anointed him as a prophet to the nations, but God has anointed you for a specific purpose and a specific plan in your life. I want to encourage you to find it and to do it today. Okay, so the so now of Jeremiah. Well, actually, it's understand that God saw that there was stuff going on that wasn't right, and God had great patience. He did through the whole of the Old Testament. But actually, people routinely chose to ignore God, but God still had a plan for them. And the so now of Jeremiah is all connected with that it doesn't matter if you're in exile, it doesn't matter if you're under siege, it doesn't matter whether you had been living it right or not. God has a plan for you, that God hasn't finished with you yet. Even though you fail him, God is patient with you. And wherever you find yourself today, God has a plan from today onwards into an incredible future with you. So I want to encourage you, spur yourself on, follow God, do it in the right way, do it with the right heart, and just follow God because he has an awesome plan for your life. And that is the book of Jeremiah.